There's a place just beyond the shore where time forgot to finish its work. A place where dreams were cast in stone and left to drown. Monte Ne, a once dazzling resort and the vision of a silver-tongued politician, now a sunken legend.
This place was once full of life and promise and ambition. Now, only pieces remain, scattered across stone and water, but the stories, they never sank.
Some say it's haunted. Others say it's hiding something. But one thing's for sure, if you stand still long enough, you'll hear the whispers. Welcome to Whispers in the Holler. Standing here among the remnants of what was once a grand vision, it's easy to get swept up in the mystery. But before Monte Ne became legend, Monte Ne was very real and deeply rooted in the story of Northwest Arkansas. To help us separate fact from folklore, I spoke with Angie Albright from the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History. She shared how Monte Ne rose from the imagination of one ambitious man and how its story still shapes the region today.
William Coin Harvey, the man, not the myth. So fill us in from your perspective. What kind of person was he and how would people have described him in his prime?
He was clearly very charismatic and he had a profound ability to persuade. And I think we don't have any recordings of him. I haven't seen a lot of descriptions of him where outside parties kind of describing what it was like to be with him. But he managed to get people to invest in sometimes crazy ideas, sometimes great ideas. And even after they failed, people would still give him money and people still showed up for him in all kinds of ways. So he must have been very persuasive, but also really smart.
He wrote bestsellers about money, but he couldn't seem to hold on to any of his own. How do you explain that disconnect?
That's a great question, and to me that's the most intriguing part of his character and who he was that ability to persuade, and yet, and he writes a very popular book in 1894 that's very nationally bestseller and all of that, but he could never hang on to any of his own money. And you know, there are idea people in this world and there are implementers in this world, and I think he was a good idea person, but I don't know that he always knew how to implement things, because the same thing happened to him with similar projects in Colorado and Utah. And he had these great ideas for entertainment, they went really well, and then they would be wiped out.
Does he strike you as someone who did have great ideas, but also thought that he was an implementer at the same time?
Yes, so he feels like he understands one particular area, this economy and the whole thing about silver and the and coinage and that kind of thing. But I think underneath it all, he didn't really understand how communities grow and work. And we have lots of planned communities here in Northwest Arkansas. We have Bella Vista and Holiday Island. And for some reason, those places worked and this place didn't.
Yeah.
And as a resort, those places have also worked, and this one didn't. So I think underneath some of that creativity was a lack of understanding about how community works and what it means to organically build a society.
Coming up, we'll dig into the rise and fall of Monte Ne with historians who know the story best. From William Coin Harvey's bold economic vision to the resort that once drew visitors from around the country.
He said no sick people were allowed to come to the resort, which is obviously totally opposite of all these other springs that were for healing purposes.
Right.
No children, and everything done at 10 p.m. When you try to control an environment like that, it's probably not going to work.
Plus, later in the show, we investigate the urban legends and unanswered questions that still linger. That's all ahead on this premiere episode of Whispers in the Holler. So, Angie, what made Coyne's financial school resonate with so many people?
Well, this is what he was really great at, is he could understand the moment, and lots of politicians and public figures get this, right? They understand what's happening in the moment. The United States had just had an economic panic and the collapse of silver, 1893, 1895, that's right when he writes the book. And when those things happen in our country, I'm sure in any society, people start looking for alternatives to the kind of like a capitalist economy, for example. So we saw it after the stock market crash in 1929. Socialism and communism was much more a pervasive idea than people realize. People are just looking around because this whole stock market deal didn't work for a lot of people, right? And that didn't pan out. But right now we have cryptocurrency. And so people are really fascinated with that. Is that a real thing? Is it not a real thing? And we just had new legislation about cryptocurrency. And so this is what humans do, especially people who are interested in the world of Wall Street and currency trading and that kind of thing.
Can you explain or talk a little bit about his fascination with silver? Like, what was silver the thing at the time?
It was. Both he and William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times. Coyne Harvey had been in Chicago for quite a few years. Bryan is from Nebraska. They're Midwesterners. They see the gold economy as something for rich people. And the gold economy was the J.P. Morgans and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers were profiting from that. And the average person, and he often talked about farmers and the common worker, didn't win out in that economy. And he felt that silver, if it were valued at a 16-to-1 ratio as gold, would be more fair to farmers and to common workers. So very populist idea. Bryan ran on that. They got a lot of support, and it didn't win out. J.P. Morgan won out.
Let's talk about that kind of political career of his for a moment. So do you see Harvey as a political showman, a populist? How would you place him in the political landscape of the era?
He fit right in. He feels special to us, and he feels kind of different to us in Arkansas. We didn't have the likes of him just yet. Things were starting to happen like that in Arkansas, right? He came here in 1899 when he had the money from his book before he'd lost money, and he spent it all building Monte Ne. But then he said, Arkansas is great because there aren't any rich people here and there aren't any rich cities. So this is my home now. So that's very populist, that's a very political statement. And of course we can laugh now, right? Because we have some of the richest people in the world here and businesses thrived here in the Ozarks. But at the same time, he is building a resort area for rich people to come to and for people to, and it didn't have quite the same vibe as like the healing springs of Hot Springs or Eureka Springs. It was a different kind of idea. So very much a populist, but with a really great political sense of the moment, that intuition about what entertains people, what they might care about, and then at the same time a complete disconnect with how people really interact with each other.
That is so interesting because initially when I read about him, like I thought this is a snake oil salesman, right? He came to town. But I think there's more to it than that because he actually did have a lot of knowledge about different facets of life. He was just missing maybe the gel that would hold it all together.
Exactly. And for example, in his resort, unlike some of the others that we knew that grew up around springs, or even in Benton County, Sulphur Springs even, he said no sick people were allowed to come to the resort, which is obviously totally opposite of all these other springs that were for healing purposes.
Right.
No children. And everything done at 10 p.m. Now, these are people on vacation, and there is a story that one night the party went long after 10 p.m., and maybe the next night he cut off the electricity at 10 p.m. This is somebody also not connected, with his audience, and when you try to control an environment like that, it's probably not going to work.
But he was really good at creating believers. So
Yes.
what do you think that says about the people of the time, that they were willing to follow someone like
Right.
Point?
Well, Arkansas probably seemed really new and kind of exotic, and the Ozarks have always had that feel, right? And the West has really opened up at that point. Economies are changing, tourism is kind of starting, and so I'm sure it also seemed like this untapped silver mine, if you will,
Yeah, sure.
here in the region that people could believe in, and he was right about that, just not in that moment and not the way he did it.
Right. It's almost like he was ahead of his time or after his time, where he just missed the mark somehow just a little
Right.
bit.
Well, he even, I think it was 1913 or so, started a road association, a road improvement, and he was trying to get people in the region to collaborate. Let's make better roads so people can get here. Well, this has been what people in the Ozarks have been grappling with, even the Native Americans would have, right? How do we get from place to place in this terrain? This is really difficult terrain. And he was trying to figure out how to do road improvements, and he thought that would help the tourism economy and the economy in general. He tried to start a railroad that came there, which it did for a few years. But he never understood that, like, especially the businesses in Rogers
Yeah.
weren't going to be interested in collaborating because they didn't want all those people leaving their city
Right.
to go spend the money somewhere else.
Interesting.
And so he never understood how to make that happen, but he wasn't wrong about the tourism and the roadways. He put Monte Ne on a space that already people were coming to. It was Silver Springs. People also, there was a tavern there in the 1850s. And he comes along, says, this is really great. And he misses the organic nature of what's already there and instead renames it and imposes his own ideas on it instead of building on what's, maybe if he kept the name Silver Springs and kind of understood how to build up from what was there, maybe it would go better.
Yeah.
One of the things that also made Harvey interesting is he brought some really new building techniques and materials to his projects too. That's another complicated layer because he's doing some really interesting things in terms of construction, engineering, and architecture that were completely new to the area. And unfortunately, it wasn't built sustainably.
And that's why we hardly have any of it
Right.
left today.
Right. And in a way, I think one of the reasons people are fascinated with this story is the damming of Beaver Lake. And you see this anywhere in the country where they've had to do, like, flood a complete area. It has completely covered up a whole bunch of stories. And we love Beaver Lake. It's great in many ways, right? We have great drinking water because of it. But it also means there are these mysteries under the water. And the Harvey mystery in Monte Ne is the most visible of those mysteries. Some of it still comes out of the ground when the water's low, and you can still see some of the structures, and it's not so long ago that you can't kind of imagine it.
From where we are now, looking back at Harvey, what part of his story do you think that people still get wrong or overlook, maybe?
I think how complicated he probably was as a person. I think time and distance, which is what history gives us, right? When there's enough decades past, you can really look at something a little differently and with new eyes and understanding. And I think when you think about all the entrepreneurial visions that have absolutely worked around here and everywhere, and his didn't, that's where we can start asking questions about, okay, this guy was complicated. What was really going on here? And was he just too grandiose? Was he delusional? And even delusional people with great ideas who fail, there's often still a kernel of something really great.
You mentioned imposing. If you go out to Monte Ne, sort of an imposing structure is his gravesite, right?
Yes.
And it's there, you can see it. And you had a fascinating story too, because he has a death mask.
Right.
And we're talking about kind of like how self-absorbed he was.
Right.
Seems like something that a self-absorbed person would do, create like a mask of their own face.
Right.
But he didn't ask for that to be made. Is that right?
No, it's a really fun story as funeral stories go. It's interesting, but no, he died when there was a hard freeze, and he couldn't be buried. And so he stayed at the funeral home or the mortuary for quite a while. And while he was there, the mortician made the mask of him. And so it does feel like this very vain project,
Yeah.
but really it was the curiosity and maybe a mortician with a lot of time on his hands.
Long before it disappeared beneath the water, Monte Ne was a playground for the elite and the stage for a dream too big to finish. After the break, we head to the Rogers Historical Museum to uncover what still remains of Harvey's vision.
His vision was to create this luxury resort, this national renowned resort where people could come and spend the summers, get away from the hot, sweltering urban life for a few months. It was kind of, for lack of a better term, a theme park in a way for the time.
And later.
Why do you think that myth or the idea maybe of buried treasure still persists today?
Yeah, and you know what's funny about that is that I find that really interesting considering the fact that Harvey did not like gold bugs as they were known, which were the people that advocated for the gold standard. They were known
Okay,
as gold
gold
bugs.
bugs.
Not exactly a positive term when you think about it.
Yeah.
And here he is with a legend that is associated with gold. So I don't know how he would think about that looking back on it.
That's all ahead on this premiere episode of Whispers in the Holler.
I connected with Serena Barnett from the Rogers Historical Museum to explore what Monte Ne meant to the people who lived near it and what it continues to mean for the generations who've grown up in its shadow.
So when William Coyne Harvey first arrived here, what exactly was he hoping to build at Monte Ne? What was his vision for the place?
His vision was to create this luxury resort, this national renowned resort where people could come and spend the summers, get away from the hot, sweltering urban life for a few months, and just really enjoy themselves. And it was kind of, for lack of a better term, a theme park in a way for the time, because it offered so many different recreations and entertainments for people to enjoy while they were there. It was really about the guest and what the guest experience would be.
Okay, so the resort he created, Monte Ne, is what he named it. It had so many layers to it: hotel, private railroad, even a bank. So from your perspective, what made it stand out from other vacation spots of the time? I mean, you just mentioned it was kind of it was
an all-encompassing resort.
Yeah.
People could come and stay there. They had luxuries in those hotels. I mean, indoor plumbing, electricity, state-of-the-art things they could do and see. If you liked hunting, they had opportunities. If you liked fishing, they had opportunities. Coyne Harvey had the very first golf course at Monte Ne here in Northwest Arkansas. And there was golf tournaments that they held there. They had boating excursions. The White River was right nearby, so yeah, fishing and boating there. Hiking, they would do day trips out to see some of the caves that were along the bluffs of the White River. And of course, they promoted the entire resort as a health resort as well.
Right.
All these natural spring waters, crystal clear, beautiful, coming out of the mountain. And of course, they have minerals in them that they promoted as a health benefit. And so that was also a draw for folks to come to spend a summer here and take in the waters at Monte Ne.
Yeah. It's interesting. It kind of personally, it reminds me of a little bit of Hot Springs area, you know, but also a little bit of Big Cedar Lodge because that's also in the Ozarks, and it kind of offers cabins and boating and
That's so true. And
golf.
even Eureka Springs.
Eureka
to
Springs to a
point.
certain extent.
And
yeah.
at the time, in the early 1900s through the 20s, Monte Ne was the third most popular resort in Arkansas behind Hot Springs and Eureka.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's good to know. We got to talk about the amphitheater, right? You got some beautiful pieces of the amphitheater here and some beautiful photography so we can actually see what it looks like, because now it's all underwater. And one of the only structures still visible today is that amphitheater, right? So what was its purpose originally, and how did it fit into his larger plan?
Well, the amphitheater's construction began in 1923. It was he started it already after the hotels had been built and the resort was going pretty good. His idea was he wanted to eventually create a obelisk or a pyramid that was going to be a time capsule for future civilizations. In Harvey's later years, he became a pessimist to the future of civilization. He had already been through an economic Depression in the 1890s. It hadn't happened yet, but we were coming up on the stock
Great
market
Depression,
crash of 29, which led to the Great Depression in the 30s. And so he had already lived through and seen what could happen when you don't have an economic stronghold. He was prepared to create a time capsule that was going to house things that future civilizations could reboot with. He had written several books. His very first book was Coin's Financial School, talking about the free silver movement, and he was going to include his books on that. He also had written books on on morals of society and how you should behave, and how you should basically do good for the greater good. And so he was going to include those books. He was going to include a globe that had the map of the Earth at the time that he was going to encapsulate this time capsule. He was going to also include an automobile to show them the technology that we had in the 1920s.
Because in his mind, they would need that.
They would need that, because if you think of it like the fall of the Roman Empire and how many things were lost in civilization for centuries until it was rediscovered. So he was planning for the future, for our future as a nation. And so he was having all these things that were going to be in his time capsule in the pyramid, but unfortunately he spent so much money building the amphitheater that he went bankrupt, and he was penniless. He could not support that dream any longer.
It was supposed to be, the amphitheater was supposed to be the base?
The base, the foundation. He was saying it was more like the foyer to his obelisk. The obelisk itself was going to be 320 feet tall.
Wow.
Just right at the top of that amphitheater.
Okay.
And it was going to, that was the true purpose of the amphitheater, was to be the site of the pyramid.
Did he have any designs for that? Do we have anything that's made it through?
Yes, he actually sold pamphlets.
Okay.
That we have one right over here on display, a reproduction of it.
Oh, I see. Yes, okay.
And he sold those pamphlets for 25 cents. Again, he was trying to raise money to support this idea. And so people could learn more about his pyramid and what he was going to be included in that, and the reason behind it and all that.
Yeah. Okay, so I read that silent films were once shown there, and that Harvey did aspirations to make Monte Ne a cultural hub. So how close did he come to achieving that dream of making it a cultural hub?
I would say he achieved it.
Yeah.
He actually, from the get-go, I mean, the first hotel opened in 1901. And that same year, he had an auditorium built. It had the first bowling alley in Northwest Arkansas, a billiards room there. He had a theater in it. He had, I mean, so many different theaters. They had an outdoor theater as well.
An outdoor theater, they had an amphitheater.
At the amphitheater, yes. They had bathhouses, and I mean, there was so much to see and do. They had a tennis court, they had a golf course, they had fox hunting was a thing at the time, so they put on fox hunts. It was truly a cultural hub for locals and out-of-towners alike.
Water is a big part of Monte Ne. Obviously, it is on the water even at the resort's time. He dammed up Silver Spring in order to make a stretch where you could ride a gondola. Can you fill us in about that?
Yes. So Silver Spring was the natural spring, or one of them, that went through the Monte Ne property, and so Coin dammed Big Spring, Silver Spring up, and Big Spring, created a lagoon and a lake. And the train depot was built right along the lake, and so people would come in on the train. And the neatest thing, Coin imported a Venetian gondola, this 50-foot handmade gondola, complete with a gondolier from Venice, brought it here to Monte Ne, and he would take the guests when they came in on the train. he would take them on the gondola and float them to their hotel.
Wow.
And he promoted Monte Ne as the only place where a gondola meets the trains. And that is just so cool that, nowhere else in America you could do that. And so that was one of our unique features with Monte Ne that no one else has. But it goes back to he was trying to enhance that guest experience.
Sure.
And do whatever he thought he could to make his resort stand out amongst the other resorts that were already going on throughout the country.
Okay, so after Harvey's time, the property passed through several hands and
Yes.
purposes. So what kind of life, as you've just mentioned, what kind of life did Monte Ne have before, Beaver Lake took over?
So it was still a bustling area. We didn't have so many people coming from, all over the country like it did in its early days. There was still the Joyzell Girls Camp, which had opened in 1923, and it went on until 1962 when the lake was put in. And that hosted girls from affluent families that would send their girls there for the summer. And it was kind of like a Girl Scout camp where they would learn camping skills and sewing skills, and they would do crafts and hikes and tell stories, and they even did their own theatrical performances at the amphitheater. It started being lesser of a destination and more of a pilgrimage site for locals. Just to see the ruins that were there. Once the lake came in the 60s, the dam was just finished being built in 1965, and then as the lake water started taking over the property, whatever was left, because many of the buildings had been torn down by the Corps, just in anticipation of the lake taking them over. But whatever was left, such as the Oklahoma Row tower that was most recently had to be torn down, that was really a pilgrimage site for locals to go and see that what history was left visibly. And unfortunately, the stories that are associated with that, a lot of people just don't know about. And so we're really excited to be able to share that here at the Rogers Historical Museum. We have a permanent display talking about the history of Monte Ne. We've got objects from the time that people can see the history firsthand. And now we're working with the Beaver Lake Corps of Engineers, as well as partnering with the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History, in order to bring actual interpretive information to the site itself. There is going to be a walking trail that will take people around the site, and there'll be panels along the trail that will show photos and tell information and timelines and things like that. So people will be able to, for the first time, be able to stand on site and learn about what happened at that location.
Next, is there really gold beneath the water? And who is the girl visitors claim to see at dusk?
When she's hanging out with her boyfriend privately at one point, there's a man that shows up and, of course, threatens them and chases them, and there's violence involved, and eventually, of course, she disappears. That annually what happens is someone sees Darla on the side of the road and picks her up, and then when they pick her up and drive her to her mother, because she's requesting to be sent to her mother because she's trying to go home because she's in distress, look in the back seat and she's gone, and there is a sweater.
The legends of Monte Ne have endured for generations, and historian and folklorist Rafi helps us separate fact from fear when we come back.
Whether it's buried treasure, ghost stories, or the ruins themselves, everyone in Northwest Arkansas seems to have heard something about Monte Ne. But how much of it is local lore, and how much is lived memory?
And historian and folklorist Rafi helps us separate fact from fear.
All right, let's talk about buried treasure. A lot of folks have talked about the potential of there being buried treasure at Monte Ne, and we think of gold being buried, even though Harvey was a silver advocate. Why do you think that that myth or the idea maybe of buried treasure still persists today.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about that is that I find that really interesting considering the fact that Harvey did not like gold bugs as they were known, which were the people that advocated for the gold standard. They were known as gold bugs. Not exactly a positive term when you think about it.
Yeah.
And here he is with a legend that is associated with gold. So I don't know how he would think about that looking back on it. But I would say that the association of treasure with Monte Ne and Harvey is more so because it is a place that feels lost in history, that had a glorious past. We look back on it with kind of maybe a nostalgia of sorts. It was this beautiful place for a resort with many different people from around the country coming. And I think a lot of times these places that feel like they were a time of the past and they kind of fell off their peak, if you will, we have these stories of treasures being buried there. I don't think it's particularly associated with him being a coin guy, because it's the wrong metal, as we point out.
Yeah.
And me having traveled all over the country to various historic sites, I have found that a lot of places that feel like they have this glorious past that's no longer there associate with it a treasure story of gold being buried somewhere on the property, because I think it adds to the mystique and the notion of a rich past.
Yeah.
That's where I think that story develops from, in a folklore context.
How does combining tales of economic vision, like this silver advocate coin was, with folklore, how does that blend maybe how the community remembers Harvey and Monte Ne?
You think about how the community remembers Harvey, for example, the Rogers History Museum, and that to me is an example of remembering not just Harvey, but Monte Ne more broadly, right? Yeah. And one of the things that, I've seen Rogers Museum talk about, the History Museum talk about, is the importance of continuing to remember that story. And I think that part of makes it so that you're still remembering the legacy that was there. But I think that connecting the economic story to it is twofold. One, remember the 1932 election or the 1932 party convention for the Liberty Party was held here at Monte Ne, and part of his platform was the silver platform, which was dated at that point, but has an economics and politics thing intersecting. And again, that's a national convention taking place right here.
Wow.
So I think that the economics part and the folklore and the sort of bigness of the story interconnects there. Mm-hmm. But also I would add that let's remember that Monte Ne was a resort for a retreat, or to kind of come for health springs, health waters. And he specifically came here, Harvey specifically came here because he said there were no rich people. And so he wanted it to be in a place where there were commoners, if you will, around that. And I think that has an economic aspect to it.
Sure.
You think about a man that came from the mountains of West Virginia, moved throughout the West into the mining country of Colorado, and comes here, specifically chooses Northwest Arkansas for its mountainous region. And in the mountainous regions of Appalachia, you tend to have a lot less economic stratification. And for a guy that is advocating, for example, silver and kind of leans toward a populist movement and is advocating for the common folks against the moneyed classes, that makes a lot of sense to open that resort here and make it a destination here. So that kind of accessibility and location of the common man, I think very much connects to the way we remember it today, because the economics and the reason that it exists in the first place is intersected.
Okay. So we're covering kind of, this buried treasure idea and the cultural icon that was Coin Harvey. Let's move into maybe something a little less tangible. Let's talk about ghosts, which is one of my favorite topics. So there's this story out there called Dear Darla. It's a ghost story that exists around the hills and the waters there of Monte Ne. Can you kind of walk us through that Dear Darla story and who Darla was and maybe the events leading to her disappearance? What do you have for us in that space, Rafi?
So the Dear Darla story, in summary, is Darla in the late 1980s is with a high school boyfriend, and they're hanging out with a group of friends, and like high school folks often do, go to an abandoned site and hang out and socialize and maybe have a drink. And when she's hanging out with her boyfriend privately at one point, there's a man that shows up and, of course, threatens them and chases them, and there's violence involved, and eventually, of course, she disappears. And so today, some of the claim is that you can still see her ghost in some of the old hotel buildings of Monte Ne, because some of the old hotel buildings are still there, of course, while submerged, but the buildings still exist. And of course, the main story is that sometime annually what happens is someone sees Darla on the side of the road and picks her up, and then when they pick her up and drive her to her mother because she's requesting to be sent to her mother because she's trying to go home because she's in distress, look in the back seat and she's gone, and there is a sweater, just her sweater. And the mother claims, now the mother died in 2023, she claims that this happens every year with the sweater story, with just a sweater.
Will someone
Because
show
it was
up at her
missing,
house
because,
and say,
yes,
hey,
someone will show up at her house, and you know, this has been happening every year since Darla actually went missing.
wow, back
So-
in the 1980s.
From 1988 to 2023, when the mother passed away.
Wow. Where do you draw the line between folklore and documented history at a place like Monte Ne? Because they kind of, to me, start to merge
They
into
do merge
one
together.
thing. Yeah.
And the way I would say, you know, they merge together is, A, you have what happened in the creation and the heyday of Monte Ne, and then B, you have what I would call the memory of Monte Ne, which is what you're talking about,
Right.
and how you remember something, it becomes part of the story at some point.
And
Now,
remember something that you didn't even, you were never there physically during
exactly,
its heyday. Right?
Exactly, which is different than an eyewitness account.
Right.
Now here's something funny. I used to work at the battlefield of Gettysburg, and at the battlefield of Gettysburg, we'd often piece together eyewitness accounts of the battle. And you would think that those are reliable because they were there, right? No. In fact, we often found that the eyewitness accounts were inaccurate by having enough other sources around to be able to demonstrate that. Why? Because sometimes the person who's on the ground isn't seeing the whole picture. They're lost, they're confused, they're misinterpreting what they're seeing. They're seeing only their narrow slice of a much larger event. And you can say the same thing in a place like Monte Ne. If I come there in a couple of days and it's raining, poor weather, that might be a very different experience than someone who's been here under sunshine and a nice weather, right? So
Right.
they might write differently about it in their perception, and or an eyewitness account many years later, sometimes the story starts to change in your mind. Sometimes I can't remember what I did last week, forget
Right.
5, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So eyewitness account isn't necessarily automatically better, but it does have value compared to the folklore insofar as, you know, you can have the documentation of their experience at the time, as well as the material. It's not just about documents, but the archaeology in this case. As you
Sure.
point out, there's some stuff underwater, but there's actual material. It's an archaeological site too. And I say that's different than the folklore in the sense that the folklore is more how we remember it later by people that did not experience it, but they have their own documentation of how they experienced the location and the site, and that's where there's some merging, but there are, I think, the divergence of the stories is that we can verify contemporary sources at the time, but not necessarily take them at face value, and look at the different way that is being remembered after the contemporary experience in the folklore. And I'll give you one funny example of this that's off topic, that's a big famous one, is George Washington. Everyone thinks of George Washington with his wig, right? He powdered his wig in
Sure.
the famous portrait. Wrong. He never wore a wig in the day of his life.
Oh, wow.
And so that's a big myth that we have in folklore. We think of George Washington.
Why do we misremember that?
Because of the fact that he sat down at the portrait, which is a very formal event, powdered his hair, not his wig. He never wore a wig. Powdering is something you might do at a very formal scenario, such as, for example, when you wear a tuxedo. How often you wear a tuxedo? Not very often.
Once a-
So
Every 2 years?
exactly.
maybe?
So it's the same thing for George Washington. Maybe, you know, a very formal event or sitting for a portrait. Because remember back then, it's not like you have an iPhone taking 1,000 photos. There's only a few likenesses of you that are going to go around. So you're sitting, in that case, for your presidential portrait, you're going to wear the tuxedo. And so he powders his hair, which is something that was uncommon. And so now we look at that. Now here's a memory part of that. We look at that. We think, there he is in the image representation of him with his white powdered hair. That must mean that he always powdered his hair or his wig. Wrong interpretation, because
Right.
we're looking at that and projecting what we think we see.
So that just happened
But that's
once
deceiving
or
us.
twice every few
Exactly,
years, and
exactly.
it was
But not
his
on a wig.
hair, not on a wig.
Now, his hair, not on a wig. So think about, that's the difference between, to me, the actual documentation.
Yeah.
We can see whether he wore a wig or not, and when he was powdering his hair, and others around him, the social norm, and the folklore, which is how we today interpret what we see without that broader context, and come up with the story of Washington wore a wig that he powdered. to connect to here from that George Washington story,
Yeah.
right? It's like the context of when he sat for the portrait and seeing that documentation is what was happening in Monte Ne in the 1900s to the 1920s and into the 1930s, and all the topics, whether it's the silver, the presidential campaign, obviously a resort town that was really important, connecting to the main railroad that was coming through the region, etc. And understanding that part compared to how generations later interpreted that site from what they saw. What they came and saw was not a resort town, it was submerged. What they saw was a ruin that was still a beautiful area, that was kind of a getaway. And so that's how you get the teenage story showing up there, interpreting it in their way, which is a teenage hangout at a cool ruin that's a getaway, because as teenagers, you love to go to cool places.
Yeah, of course.
And then that redefines a place as where those events took place for Dear Darla, that then leads to the ghost story. So that's the comparison that I would make between George Washington and Monte Ne in understanding the original context and the folklore.
I love it. There's something that still draws us to that place today.
Absolutely.
So thanks for hanging out, Robbie.
Thank you.
Thanks for filling us in. We've heard the history, we've explored the legends, and we've stood in the very places where it all unfolded. But Monte Ne is so much more than just a story. It's a reminder of how ambition, memory, and mystery shape a place long after its walls have crumbled.
So from your perspective as a historian, how do you interpret Monte Ne now? Is it a story of ambition, of loss, of legacy? What are your thoughts?
I say it's a little of all three.
Yeah.
It is a story about a man's dream. His realizing that dream, and then unfortunately things that were mostly out of his control, which made that dream die off. But we now have that legacy. He really, in the early 1900s, he foresaw something in Northwest Arkansas that no one else up to that point had really seen could be a destination, utilizing the natural resources that we have in order to draw people from all over the country, possibly the world, to this area in order to experience that. And it's interesting that today we are seeing that revitalization of utilizing our natural resources. We've got so many trails and campsites, and of course the Beaver Lake has recreational opportunities now, that we are utilizing our natural resources even today as a tourism draw, as McCoy Harvey had done for his Monte Ne resort in the early 1900s.
Yeah, that is fascinating to think that he saw what we could be, and that's what we have become. It just came to fruition later than he would have liked.
Exactly. And I mean, he's often been called eccentric, but I see him as just an entrepreneur. He had a dream and he wanted to fulfill that dream, and he did everything that he could in order to make it work.
As we close this chapter of Whispers in the Holler, I wanted to spend a few more moments here at the water's edge, to listen, to reflect, and to let the whispers speak for themselves.